goodness, a lot of people here today. Congratulations on making the effort to attend a conference, because they're always inspiring and you always learn something new. And the important thing in life is to live on the boundary between the darkness and the light. That's where you're always learning something new every day. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Food Advisory Board, which is a group of scientists and health professionals who look at individual food issues as they arise and determines the genuine, truthful, scientific consensus for that particular issue. We do get educational grants from Hibiki Cymru here in Wales, from Quality Meat in Scotland, and from the Agriculture and Horticultural Development Board, which is based in Warwickshire. And we look at all foods, plant foods, animal foods, special examples of marine foods like krill. We're always looking across the whole piece of different foods that make up a balanced diet. As the chair said, health and happiness go very tightly together. If you're happy, you're more likely to be healthy, and if you're healthy, you're much more likely to be happy. A student sent me a birthday card once which had a hippie on the front, and inside it said, "Who cares when you were born, man, so long as you're really living." I've always liked that and kept it in my laboratory. So we're looking at malnutrition now in the United Kingdom, and as the chair has already said, one of the major problems is not just supplying the food, but ensuring that the patient actually eats it. And lots of nurses in hospitals are so busy they don't have time to sit at the end of the bed and just check that the patient is eating the food. If you're not eating the food, then you are significantly undermining the therapies that are being applied to cure a particular condition. This is the latest review of the data, and it tells us that 90% of British people are not eating a healthy, balanced diet, which is quite surprising when you think dietitians have known about what constitutes a healthy, balanced diet for the best part of 60 years. Jean-Maurice Savarin was the first person to say, "Dites-moi ce que vous mangez, et je vous dirai ce que vous êtes." Tell me what you eat and I will tell you what you are. And we've known that for over 100 years, and yet still we keep doing things incorrectly. I don't think we should have called ourselves Homo sapiens. I think that was a vote of arrogance. We should have called ourselves Homo ostrichii, because there's nothing we like better than sticking our heads in the sand and ignoring what's coming towards us. So here is the balanced diet that most of you will be familiar with. Man is an omnivore. He didn't choose to be born an omnivore, just as a lion didn't choose to be born a carnivore. That's just the way we're built. Our enzymic system, the organization of our gut, even the arrangement of our teeth, is to deal with an omnivorous diet. Elsie Widdowson, who is often regarded as the pioneer of nutrition in the UK, was a good friend of mine, and Elsie always used to say, the best diet is one where you eat a little bit of everything and don't eat too much of any one thing. And when I asked her why not to eat too much of any one thing, she said, food's always getting contaminated. So, for example, tuna is a really good food, but in the seas of Japan, you've got a high pollution of methyl mercury. So it isn't a good idea to eat tuna every day, even though it is a very good food. So here you can see 2/3 are coming from the plant kingdom here, and 1/3 largely is coming from the animal kingdom. And by the animal kingdom, we're not just meaning red meat and chicken here. We're meaning eggs, dairy food, all the foods that you can get from the sea, particularly shrimps, etc., but just of an animal origin. Let me just point out to you a small anomaly here, and that is the role of fruit. Fruit is a deception perpetrated on animals by plants. because the fruit is prepared by the plant with the express intention of being eaten by animals, so that the animals will pass the seeds through their gut and distribute the seeds a long way away from the parent plant. So just before the fruit ripens, the plant pulls all the nutrients out of the fruit back into the plant, into the stems, into the leaves, and just leaves a bit of sugar and a bit of vitamin C and a bit of fibre to keep the animals coming back eating the fruit. So don't see fruit as a really good way of making up your 5 a day. Vegetable material, leaves, stems, flowers, ancient seeds like rye, these are where all the nutrients are in a plant. And if you're trying to lose weight, then you adapt the balanced diet by extending the vegetable material and reducing the carbohydrates. Potatoes, cereals, bread and pasta, the main component is starch. And starch is made entirely of glucose. And the glycemic index of potatoes is almost identical to sucrose in table sugar. So don't pack your diet with starch unless you need a lot of energy. It is much better to pack your diet with fibrous material coming from stems and leaves. And don't forget, if you do drink skimmed milk here, if it's had the fat skimmed off it, then it will have had the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, skimmed off it as well. So if your basic source of milk is skimmed milk, then every fortnight just buy a small amount of whole milk so that you can get the vitamins A, D, E, and K, which won't be absorbed without fat in the diet anyway. Now this is sort of David Attenborough's view of the countryside, and it's a beautiful stretch of Welsh hillside, but it's not what a scientist sees when we look at the environment. We see all these atoms being recycled. Okay, so all the atoms that we use to build biological systems were only produced once in the last 5 billion years in our part of the Milky Way galaxy. So they all have to be recycled. And in the course of 10 years, you exchange every atom in your body with the environment. That's why it's so important to have a lot of species that are involved in the recycling of the atoms to maintain human life. And as biodiversity falls, you can't recycle all the atoms, so gradually our food becomes less and less nutritious, and we're on our way out. That's why we talk about biodiversity being so critical in maintaining human life. So if we connect these together, what the species are doing is they're recycling all these atoms. So there's nobody in this room that's older than 10 years. The only thing that is older than 10 years is our design. And we're replacing all the matter completely over a 10-year period. And nutrition, of course, is getting all those atoms into us. And the richest source of vitamins and minerals in the diet is, of course, red meat, mammals. And here you've got sheep in the upland areas. You've got cows in the meadows. And you've got pigs in the woodlands. And these animals share 80% human genes with us because we're all mammals. So most of the things that these animals have to make are required by us, and lots of them haven't even been identified yet because we don't know what some of the genes do. But we do know that 80% of genes are human, are shared with humans in this case. Now, you will know that trust at the moment is in short supply at every part of our society. People have got into the habit now of manipulating others because they have a preferred opinion. For example, a person may love animals and decide to become a vegan. There's nothing wrong with that as a personal choice. Because they love animals, they don't want to see animals killed. That's a personal choice. But it would be a big mistake then to run a widespread email campaign to force other people not only to become vegan, but to actually raise their children under a strict vegan regime, under the pretext that it's better for their health, because that would be totally wrong and totally against the science. And in the last 3 years, several children have been removed from vegan parents simply because they were damaging the children too much by trying to keep them on a totally animal-free diet. The other criticism that you often see in the newspapers is that farm animals are bad for the environment because they produce methane. But people forget that the cow pays back to the land by defecating on it. The pig pays back to the land by breaking up the top 9 inches of surface and then defecating on it. In other words, the animals enrich the land. That's why they've evolved in balance with the plants. They are constantly enriching the soil, enriching the land, returning the nutrients. And if you don't have animals on land, it's not better for the environment because you have to make artificial fertilizers out of petroleum. And then, of course, it just runs off the land, it's water soluble, into the watercourses and poisons all the fish. There is nothing better for land than having animals on it, working it, defecating and urinating on it, replenishing its nutritional content. So that's a complete piece of misinformation that animals are bad for the environment. In fact, on the uplands of Wales, the best crop you can possibly grow is grass. And the sheep convert a food that we cannot eat into a food that we can. And I don't know anything else that can grow better than grass on the Welsh hillsides. The other thing that I've seen a lot of over the last few years was the announcement by the International Agency for the Investigation of Cancer, which was produced a report. IARC produced this report under the support of the World Health Organization. But none of us in the scientific community could understand this report. Firstly, because there is no single recorded case of a cancer actually being caused by eating a lean red meat or a red meat product. Not a single one, which is really quite staggering when you look at that report that came out of the World Health Organization. So how does that happen? How do people produce a report that is not accepted by the scientific community, but is quoted all over in newspapers and televisions? And I said to the science editor of the Times, why are you publishing all this information when the scientific community has said that it's misinformation, it's not correct? And Nigel Hawkes said to me, you must regard journalists as unreliable allies. We are paid to sell copy. The more sensational the copy is, the more newspapers we sell and the more we get promoted. And that's just a simple truth. And that was from the science editor of the Times. So I was really quite shocked. He said to me that a journalist can be sacked for missing a story, but he's never sacked for exaggerating. Which again, I was incredibly shocked by. So you end up with very few groups of people in society that you can trust. I think nurses are a very trustworthy population, and there's no doubt that your patients trust you and they rely on you. And in the teaching profession, we have some very active teachers who are completely trustworthy and are trusted not only by their pupils but by parents. But when you move away from those vocational professions, which have a mixture of caring and knowledge put together, then it's harder and harder to find a trustworthy source of information. And that's why the Food Advisory Board was actually set up. So you can ask us questions about food issues, we'll give you an honest answer, and you can check that answer then in the scientific literature. I suppose what really made me fed up about the World Health Organization paper on cancer was it took lean red meat and processed meat that we've been eating for 7 million years, as you can see in cave paintings all over the world. We've been eating wild game for 7 million years. It took those and it put them in little groups with plutonium, a radioactive isotope, with arsenic, with tobacco smoke and exhaust fumes. In other words, things which we know are either toxic or directly carcinogenic. If you feed plutonium to laboratory mice, they get tumours very quickly because of the radioactive emissions. If you feed processed meat to the same laboratory mice in the same quantities, they just get fat. You don't see tumours. So it's when the scientific community knows that, it's very sceptical when it sees a report that puts known poisons in the same category as a food of long-standing usage, like lean red meat. So we have to assume they've got some hidden agenda. Their hidden agenda may be something to do with climate change, maybe something to do with not wanting animals to be farmed. It can be very complex, but it's certainly not to do with preserving public health. So sheep, pigs and cows, each one of those groups of animals shares 80% of their genes with humans. If you don't think that's a good idea, consider the fact that in the first 6 months of a baby's life, all the baby's nutrients are coming from the breast milk, and the mother shares 100% of her genes, human genes, with the baby that she's producing. So in fact, you get a much more direct delivery of appropriate nutrients from animals that share your genetic base. How are these levels determined so that we can work out when malnutrition is occurring? Well, we take a population of people, about 30,000, and we measure the quantity of nutrient needed by a particular number of people. And you'll always find that whatever the nutrient is, there's a group that needs a very high level of nutrient, and there's a small group that needs a low level. But most people fall into this mid group here. This is a Gaussian curve named after Carl Friedrich Gauss because it shows a smooth distribution of a continuous variable. So once we've done that for every individual nutrient, we can estimate the average requirement for the whole population. But then we've got to give guidelines to public health workers to assess diets, and they need some sort of limits. They can't just work to the average. So we add twice the standard error of the mean, and we deduct twice the standard error of the mean, and that creates this square that fits over the curve. And now within this square, we meet the needs of 95% of the population. So the upper reference nutrient here meets the needs of 97.5% of the whole population and allows for all the individual variation. So that's a really useful figure for people who are planning public health development for the future. And at the lower end here, you have the lower reference nutrient intake, which meets only 2.5% of the population's needs. So technically speaking, if your population has a good state of nutrition, everyone should be taking into their diet more than the level that meets 2.5% of the population. So now we look at some national diet and nutrition statistics that are produced by the government through the Department of Health, and you get a big shock. There's the 2.5% level, and these are all the people that have a level which is lower than 2.5%. And you'll see in the case of iron, these young women, 19 to 24, 40% of them have an intake in their diet which is below the lower reference level of 2.5%. So straight away you identify that young women are having a poorer diet than older women because the older women are cooking their meals from raw ingredients. The young ones are getting too many ready-made meals that have been doctored for various reasons by food companies. So you can see vitamin A is underrepresented, riboflavin is underrepresented, iron is particularly underrepresented, particularly in teenage girls who make the mistake of cutting red meat out of the diet because they think it will help them to stay slim. Instead, they should be just choosing lean red meat that has a low fat content, and that's quite easy to identify. Then you've got calcium, magnesium, potassium, zinc, and iodine. So we can demonstrate in the National Diet and Nutrition Survey that there are specific nutrients and specific vitamins that are in short supply in the UK population. Now, the Radiological Commission for Europe has actually calculated the number of atoms of every element present in every organ in the human body and every tissue. And you can see hydrogen and oxygen are by far the most common. But the ones I've ringed here are the ones where we have problems. So calcium. Getting calcium into girls at puberty is really important because 50% of their bone density when they reach menopausal status will have been established during puberty. So getting vitamin D and calcium into children at that puberty point is really critical. And this is where nurses' advice to patients becomes so useful and so direct. And you can save the National Health Service a fortune if you can feed correct dietary information into people at the right age when they require it. Here's potassium, without which you can't produce nerve impulses. Here's magnesium, without which you can't use muscle. Here's the iron and the zinc. Zinc is particularly appropriate because, of course, we're coming up to the festive season, and the enzyme in the blood that protects your brain from alcohol is alcohol dehydrogenase. And if you take that enzyme apart, you find it's got 2 atoms of zinc in the middle of it, without which it can't work. So again, red meat is a rich source of zinc. There are several nuts that are also a rich source of zinc. So make sure you've got zinc in your diet if you're intending to drink a lot over Christmas, because that enzyme won't work without the zinc being built in. Then you've got iodine, which is necessary for the thyroid hormone. And then you've got selenium. There are 26 proteins in the human body that cannot be made without selenium, and they're essential to our well-being. If we list those minerals according to atomic size, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I just want to give you an indication that the scientific community isn't just looking at the food. It's taking the food completely apart, down to the smallest subatomic particle, and working out why it's important. And I'll just give you one example. The outer electron ring here of an atom determines its chemistry, because that's the outer ring of electrons that connects with other atoms. And if you look at selenium here, it's got 6 electrons in its outer orbit. That's exactly the same as sulfur. So in the human body, selenium coming in the diet will replace sulfur in amino acids that contain sulfur and create, for example, selenocysteine. That's why it makes unique proteins. Here's the mitochondria. This is something that people know very little about, and yet it's so important in nutrition. People often ask me, why do I feel tired when my iron intake is low? You will know that iron is necessary to build hemoglobin, to transport oxygen in the blood, and it's necessary to produce myoglobin to handle oxygen availability in muscle. But what you probably didn't know is that this symbiotic bacterium that lives in every cell in the human body cannot function without iron, and it produces all the energy that we need to run our lives. So when a woman produces an ovum in the ovary, she puts half of her human DNA into the nucleus of the ovum, but into the cytoplasm she inoculates her unborn baby with this symbiotic bacterium, the mitochondrium. And that will give the baby then, every time the baby's cells divide in embryology, these bacteria are dividing by binary fission, just like wild free-living bacteria, and they're going into every cell in the body. And they're coming entirely from the mother. It's very rare for the male to contribute any mitochondrial bacteria to the next generation. So, you can see bacterial DNA here, which is obviously not human, and you can see these little membranes. Why am I putting this on in such detail? This is the battery that provides all the energy for every cell in the body, whether it's a brain cell or a muscle cell. So if it doesn't work properly, you are in big trouble in terms of maintaining your health. When we breathe in oxygen, the oxygen is transported by hemoglobin to the tissues. It then diffuses through the tissues to the mitochondria. When it reaches this bacterium, it gets caught by cytochrome oxidase enzymes, which cannot be built without iron. So you needed iron for hemoglobin, iron for myoglobin, and now you need iron for cytochromes, because they are going to produce the energy that drives the rest of the body. So the oxygen is passed along here, and at the end of the chain, it's going to be bound with hydrogen. You've probably asked yourself, why do I eat carbohydrates to get energy? And it's because carbohydrates contain hydrogens that can be clipped off the molecule and picked up by coenzymes and transported to the mitochondria. So this is the fundamental chemistry of life and health. The hydrogen atoms are being transported down here as well, and at the end of the chain they're bolted onto the oxygen to produce water. And an enormous amount of energy is produced. And it's built into little chemicals like ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that goes out then to the rest of the body. So anyone who is short of iron is going to underperform in terms of the energy that they require for every bit of chemistry in their life. And here now we've got the vitamins of concern. Luckily we're doing quite well on vitamins. There are only 4 that concern us at the moment. B2, riboflavin, which is a hydrogen carrier, picks up hydrogen in the cell and takes it to the mitochondria to be used for energy production. Folic acid, which we'll look at in detail. Vitamin A, retinol. If you have low levels of vitamin A, you tend to have night blindness. And in India, they have hundreds of thousands of people deficient in vitamin A, who suffer from night blindness. And then vitamin D, of course, which you want to get into children of puberty, calcitriol. People often don't realize that vitamin D, when it's produced in the skin as a result of ultraviolet light striking the skin, it's cholesterol in the skin that's being converted into the vitamin D precursor. So it's one of the reasons why you do need to have cholesterol in your body. That's why it's circulating. We make our sex hormones out of cholesterol. We make our bile salts out of cholesterol. We make our steroid hormones for defending our body out of cholesterol. So don't let anyone tell you that cholesterol is a bad thing to have in your body. It's a good thing to have, but you want it in certain circumstances and in certain quantities. And that's why I put that picture at the beginning of my talk on about balance. Everything is about balance. Not too much of something, not too little of something. And if you can find the right balance between work and play, between love and hate, then you can lead a very happy life. Let's look here now then at low folate status. You'll all know that women are encouraged to get folate into their system before they conceive. You don't want to be trying to get folate into your system when your embryo is several months old. You want the folate in the mother's body before the conception takes place, if possible. So here's a very early development. Without folate, you can't synthesize DNA. So here in the embryo, you've got the neural plate on the dorsal surface of the embryo, and it has to curl up to produce the spinal cord. It can only curl up by the cells reproducing really quickly. And to reproduce quickly, they've got to duplicate all their DNA. And you can't manufacture DNA without vitamin B12, and without folate, and without riboflavin. So these are really important substances. And 10% of the British population have a mutation that stops them recycling folate. So they are particularly at risk of neural tube defects. So here you can see the neural plate is not closing quickly enough, so you're getting spina bifida at the tail end, and at the anterior end it's not closing quick enough, so you're getting hydrocephalus. Now this is what journalists believe is the actual state of nutrition. That if 1 unit of something does you good, 100 units will do you 100 times as good. This is completely untrue. The true picture is this. A little bit of something in nutritional terms does you a huge benefit, and every additional bit gives you less benefit until it gives you no benefit, and then it starts to kill you. So don't be misled by the idea that the more you have, the better you'll be. And we can calculate for every ethnic group, for every occupation, for every age group, for every sex. We can calculate exactly what is required for a healthy life. There are now 17 different sexual polymorphs in the human population, and they all need slightly different diets, particularly the extreme ones, the alpha female and the alpha male. You may not have been aware, because men have been misleading women for thousands of years, that the default condition of a human embryo is to produce a female. So if you've got two X's in the embryo, you'll get a female. If you've got an X and a Y, then you'll get a male. Let me just show you. I've got in my pocket here the first human genome that was ever sequenced. So this gives you the complete instructions to build a human being in your garage over the weekend, and you only need two pieces of equipment that are about 2 cubic feet square. Here's the X chromosome, and it's full of genes for producing a healthy human life. And the girls have got two, of course. And here's the Y chromosome. One of the reasons why women outperform men in health is because they've got two copies of the X chromosome. So you've got two chances to get a good gene on the X chromosome. The boys have only got one chance. So if they've got a recessive gene on here that causes an illness, it's going to show. But look at this Y chromosome. Clearly it's not necessary for human health, because none of the girls have got it. It contains 20 genes, and its sole purpose is to modify the embryological development of a female and turn her into a male. We have a population of people in the Dominican Republic that have a mutation that stops the Y chromosome working until the child reaches an age of 12. We call them the guayvadochis. So with an XY in that particular population, you have female organs, female appearance, all the way up to 12 years of age. And then the Y chromosome is switched on, and you turn into a fully functional male, and you can sire children. The gonadal tissue is lowered out of the body to produce external testes, because sperm won't mature unless it's kept at 2 degrees below body temperature. The organs are changed, and they become fully functional fathers. So that demonstrates the point very clearly. So if you have a man in your life who doesn't believe that he's an underdeveloped woman, stand him in front of a mirror, take his shirt off, point to the nipples on his chest and say, just exactly what were you going to do with these jewels? The point I'm making here is that all those minerals and vitamins that we are concerned of are available in red meat. And liver, of course, multiplied up, and in kidney. But what we feed animals changes their nutritional value for humans. So here's long-chain omega-3 fats being measured in cows that have been fed on grass and cows that have been fed on a more artificial mix, the concentrates. And you'll see that long-chain omega-3s like EPA and DHA can be 5 times more abundant in a pasture-fed animal than in an animal fed on artificial feeds. So we should be paying less for a corn-fed chicken and more for a pasture-fed chicken. Humans need nearly half a gram a day of EPA and DHA. I'm going to whistle through this little bit now because I want, obviously, to keep everyone on time. And you'll have copies of these available on the website so you can see what they mean, and you can see what this means, that we're designing a totally inappropriate urban lifestyle where people don't use energy on steps but waste their energy on escalators. This is a really important thing, and I'll just mention that when you put something in your mouth, the pancreas immediately releases insulin in anticipation of blood glucose going up and needing to be brought down. As soon as the blue line goes up here and insulin is released, the enzyme that is responsible for breaking down your subcutaneous fat is switched off. It's not going to be needed because new food is coming in, so you won't break down fat. So just a very important scientific point there, that if you're trying to lose abdominal fat, you won't lose it if you're putting something in your mouth. Even if you put a glass of orange juice in your mouth and spit it out, and don't even swallow it, when we measure the blood level of insulin, it's gone up, and the fat breakdown has been switched off. This is all done at Oxford by Keith Frayne and his group, and it's all well documented. Now, if we look, I've never understood people that own a car and never look under the bonnet to check out the engine. So I know this brain very well because it's my own brain, and I like to look at it from time to time to see how it's ticking over. And if we just zoom in a bit, there you can see the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And just in this region, well, you've got the pleasure center here, which determines the continuation of activity. The satiety center is next to it here, but just in front here is the biological clock, which is being linked to the environment by signals from the eye. This biological clock is then controlling every clock in every organ in the body, and it has some really significant consequences as far as health is concerned. Frayne and his group demonstrated that if you eat a meal at breakfast time, you will absorb 15%, you will store 15% as subcutaneous fat. If you eat the same meal at 12 o'clock, you will store just over 30%. But if you eat the same meal after 7 o'clock at night, you'll store 45 to 50% of it. Because the clock is telling the body, you're going to need this food in the morning, so we won't store it if it's coming in at breakfast time. But if it's coming in at evening time, the clock is telling the body, you're not going to need this, so store it, because you're going to be sleeping for the rest of the evening. Just to demonstrate the importance of activity, this is the best study that's available in the literature. 30,000 London transport workers and the drivers of the buses have 2 or 3 times more cardiovascular disease than the conductors, who, of course, are moving. And I could tell you an awful lot about that. Maybe we can pick it up later. But we've got politicians to look after us. And here you'll see George has forgotten to take the covers off the binoculars. But he doesn't let truth get in the way of a good picture. So even though he can't see, he carries on talking as if he could. This tells us that politics is the art of government, it's not the science of government. And no politician is ever encumbered by a need to address the facts. Politicians pull ideas out of the air and then they look for evidence to support it, whereas scientists look at the evidence without prejudice, ideally, and then they gather the evidence and then determine policy from the evidence. So I commend an evidence-based policy to you as a way forward for government. So we come to this point now near the end where we can see that each of these lifestyle positions requires special treatment. Up to the first 5 years of life, there should be no restriction of any fat fed to a child because they need the full range of fats, saturated and unsaturated. The melting point of a saturated fat is 70 degrees centigrade. The human body is at 37 degrees centigrade, and unsaturated fats melt at 11 degrees centigrade. So if you only had unsaturated fats in your body, your whole body would flow off your bones onto the ground. You need some saturated fats to maintain the solidity of cell membranes. Then you've got the child here, and I've already mentioned about the importance coming up to puberty. You've got the teenager here who makes the mistake of cutting red meat out of her diet just as she's beginning to menstruate and lose iron through menstruation. You've got the middle-aged lady here who needs the long-chain omega-3s to protect her from cardiovascular disease. And then after the age of 60, the absorption efficiency in the gut diminishes significantly. So after the age of 60, you really need foods that are rich in vitamins and minerals because your efficiency of absorption is much, much lower. And so it's harder for you to get the vitamins and minerals that you need. And I brought a special slide here along because I do feel that you should be rewarded for coming to conferences like this. This is the latest discovery from the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and it shows that there are microtubules between brain cells in elderly brains. And imagine this cell getting old and becoming impaired chemically. It builds insoluble proteins. Now, we used to think that senile dementia spread through the brain because the cells were all getting older. But now we know from this study that if one cell gets very old suddenly, even at the age of 30 years of age, it can transport the insoluble proteins down these nanotubules into perfectly healthy cells and render them ineffectual. So in other words, in senile dementia, it's not all the cells aging at the same rate. Some cells are aging faster, and they're affecting the other cells like a spread of disease through the brain. So I come back now to balance. We have got malnutrition in the UK. If we choose our foods wisely, we can avoid it, and we can live healthier and happier lives. And we learn from this that it's not the path that you choose in life that determines your health and your happiness. It is the way that you walk it.